In the heart of an old Parisian café, aged yet elegant with wooden panels and vintage lighting, an elderly man named Henri shuffled through the doors. At 88, he moved slowly, his frail frame cloaked in a worn-out coat. Outside, the chilly autumn wind had reddened his nose, and he seemed to carry the weight of the city's history within his tired bones. The café was filled with the soft clinking of cups, low murmurs of conversation, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Customers barely glanced up as Henri made his way to the counter, his trembling hands holding on to a few worn coins. All he wanted was a sandwich, something small to soothe the emptiness in his stomach. The woman behind the counter, Camille, was known for her stern demeanor. Her crisp white apron, freshly starched, was stark against her dark clothes, and her narrowed eyes scanned Henri with a mixture of disdain and impatience. As he timidly asked for the cheapest item on the menu, her gaze hardened, lips pressing into a thin line. Camille crossed her arms, tilting her head with an almost mocking disbelief. "This isn't a soup kitchen, old man," she sneered, her voice sharp enough to make a few patrons glance up. "If you don't have the money, don't waste my time." Henri's cheeks flushed with humiliation as he looked down at his hands, dirtied and trembling, the loose coins slipping through his thin fingers. Around him, he could feel the whispers, the sneers barely concealed by raised cups and polite smiles. The humiliation settled over him, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he wanted to disappear into it. Yet, despite the shame, he didn't move. His hunger kept him rooted, even as tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. Seated nearby was a woman named Elodie, a tall figure with a dignified presence. She had a quiet grace about her, a hint of strength beneath her refined appearance. Dressed in a dark coat and scarf, her eyes, sharp and observant, had been following the interaction closely. There was something about Henri's appearance, his worn-out coat, the weathered face lined with grief, that struck her deeply. But more than anything, she noticed the glint of a watch on his wrist, a piece that seemed strangely familiar. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it really be? She leaned in slightly, her attention fully absorbed, her eyes never leaving Henri's trembling hand that rested on the counter. And then, her heart froze. She was almost certain she had seen that watch before. The memories rushed over her, memories of a young man, a love long lost, and a future that never came to be. Her pulse quickened, and she knew she couldn't just sit there. Driven by an impulse she barely understood, Elodie stood, her gaze firm, her heart beating faster than it had in years. She approached the counter, her elegant figure cutting through the tension as she came to stand beside Henri, her voice steady yet soft. "I'll pay for his meal," she announced, her words leaving no room for argument, her eyes fixed on Camille with a look that dared anyone to challenge her. Camille was momentarily taken aback, her smug expression faltering as she glanced between Elodie and Henri. But Elodie had already turned her attention to the elderly man, reaching out gently to touch his wrist, where the watch gleamed faintly. Her breath caught in her throat as she confirmed her suspicion. Henri, startled by the sudden warmth of Elodie's touch, lifted his gaze to meet her eyes. His own were filled with confusion and a hint of embarrassment, yet Elodie's expression was soft, reassuring. She gave him a gentle smile, the kind that spoke of understanding and kindness, something Henri hadn't felt from a stranger in what seemed like years. Elodie gestured for him to follow her to a quiet corner table away from the watchful eyes of other patrons. With some hesitation, Henri allowed himself to be guided, his dignity preserved by the small yet powerful kindness she had extended. As they sat down, the watch on Henri's wrist caught Elodie's attention once again. She couldn't look away, as if the delicate metal and its slight wear held an unspoken history. A whirlwind of memories flooded her mind. Years ago, she had given this exact watch as a gift to a young man she loved more than anything in the world. His name was Julian, and he had been her everything. They had dreamt of a future together, of love and happiness. But those dreams had been shattered by a tragic accident that took him away far too soon. For a moment, Elodie was lost in her memories, her fingers brushing the edge of the table as if grounding herself back to the present. Finally, she looked at Henri, her voice barely a whisper. "That watch. Where did you get it?" Henri's face softened, and he looked down at the watch with a small, melancholic smile. "It belonged to my son," he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Julien was his name. He passed away years ago." His voice wavered as he spoke, the grief still fresh in his heart despite the passage of time. The name fell between them like a stone, stirring up emotions they both thought had been buried long ago. Elodie's hand flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. Julien. The same man she had once loved, the one she had mourned every day since his loss. Her heart raced, both in sorrow and in unexpected joy, as she realized that the man sitting across from her was none other than Julien's father. The shock and the weight of this discovery took her breath away, and she fought to steady herself, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. Henri watched her reaction with a mix of confusion and curiosity, sensing a connection he couldn't quite understand. Did you know my son?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with a fragile hope. Elodie nodded, her voice breaking as she replied, "Yes, Henri. I loved him. Julien was the love of my life." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion, each of them grappling with the unexpected connection that had surfaced in that humble café. As they sat together, an unspoken understanding blossomed between them, binding them not just by memories of Julien, but by the shared grief and love that connected their souls. Henri's eyes filled with tears as he absorbed Elodie's words. For a moment, he seemed to lose himself in memories of Julien, his only son, who had once been the light of his life. He had never imagined meeting someone who had shared in that love, someone who knew the Julien he remembered so vividly. A flicker of gratitude softened his face, yet his voice trembled with vulnerability as he spoke. "I had no idea. I never knew my son had found someone who loved him so deeply." Elodie reached across the table, gently placing her hand over Henri's trembling fingers. She offered him a small, reassuring smile. "Julien was everything to me," she whispered, her voice breaking as memories poured over her. "He brought so much light, so much hope. I've missed him every day since he left." She paused, the pain of that loss rekindling within her. "But seeing you here, it's almost as if fate wanted us to meet." Henri nodded, his gaze cast downward. His face bore the weight of years spent grieving in solitude, his soul still carrying the ache of Julien's absence. "After he passed," he said slowly, "my wife and I, we lost our way. Eleanor, she couldn't handle the pain. She blamed me, blamed the world, and eventually, we lost everything we once had." He took a shuddering breath, his voice a blend of sorrow and regret. "Now we have nothing, nowhere to go. She's waiting for me outside, sitting alone in the cold." Elodie's heart clenched at the thought of Julien's mother, Eleanor, sitting on a park bench with nothing but the cold biting through her coat. Her gaze grew fierce with determination, and she looked at Henri with newfound resolve. "Henri, let me help. I know we can't bring Julien back, but maybe we can find a way to honor him, to rebuild what was lost." Henri looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He had grown so accustomed to indifference from others that Elodie's kindness felt almost like a dream. Why would you do this for us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elodie's expression softened, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. "Because I loved Julien, and because I believe he would want me to do this. For you, for Eleanor, for all of us to finally find peace." After a pause, Henri nodded, his heart touched by her words. Together, they rose from the table and headed out of the café, Elodie guiding Henri with a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her steps were steady, her purpose unwavering, as she prepared to meet Eleanor. When they arrived at the park, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the city, though the air remained cold. Sitting alone on a worn bench, Eleanor huddled within her thin coat, her shoulders hunched against the wind. Her once bright eyes had dulled over the years, weighed down by grief and resentment. As Henri approached with Elodie by his side, Eleanor lifted her gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice carrying the faint bitterness of years spent in sorrow. Henri took a tentative step forward, his eyes pleading. "Eleanor, this is Elodie. She knew Julian. She loved him too." At the mention of her son's name, Eleanor's face softened for an instant before hardening again. She looked at Elodie, her gaze filled with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. "You're the reason we lost him, aren't you?" Her words were sharp, and Henri winced as they cut through the air. Elodie, however, met Eleanor's glare with calm and compassion, refusing to be shaken. "No," Elodie replied gently, her voice steady. "I loved Julian. Losing him shattered me too. But today, I'm here because I believe that he would want us to help each other, to find peace in his memory." She took a step closer, her tone softening. "I know the pain you carry, Eleanor. I've carried it too. But perhaps, together, we can help each other find some healing." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, her defenses beginning to crack. For so long, she had clung to anger, believing it was all that remained of her son. But now, facing someone who had loved Julian as deeply as she had, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of hope. Her gaze shifted from Elodie to Henri, who was looking at her with gentle, understanding eyes. Slowly, Eleanor nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Elodie offered her hand, a silent promise of support and compassion. Hesitantly, Eleanor reached out, her fingers trembling as they met Elodie's warm, steady hand. In that simple touch, a bond was formed, a connection between two women who had both loved and lost the same man, and a promise to move forward together. Over the next few weeks, Elodie welcomed Henri and Eleanor into her home. She provided them with warmth, care, and a chance to rebuild their lives. Together, they shared stories of Julian, recalling his laughter, his dreams, and the light he had brought into each of their lives. The days were filled with healing conversations and quiet moments, as they slowly allowed themselves to release the weight of their grief. In time, Elodie helped Henri and Eleanor find a small apartment nearby, a humble yet cozy place where they could start anew. On the day they moved in, Henri and Eleanor looked around their new home, their eyes filled with gratitude. As they settled in, Elodie joined them, bringing a small housewarming gift, a framed photograph of Julian, his smile radiant, his eyes full of life. They placed it on a small table by the window, a reminder of the love that had brought them together. As the three of them sat down for their first meal in Henri and Eleanor's new home, a sense of peace settled over them. They had come together through loss, but in each other, they had found a new kind of family, one built on love, forgiveness, and resilience. For the first time in years, they felt a sense of belonging, a quiet hope for the future. And as they raised their glasses in a silent toast to Julian, they knew he was with them, watching over them, his spirit woven into the bonds they had created. Together, they had found a way to honor his memory. A new beginning, filled with healing and the promise of brighter days.